Hello everyone, welcome back to the Old Warlock. My name's Alex.
I'm Jim.
And today, you guys seem to love the last video about the Satanic Panic. We enjoyed that video quite a bit too. So we thought that what we wanted to do, because you guys not only liked it a lot, but you seemed to engage with it quite a bit. We got a lot of comments on that video from you guys talking about your experiences with the Satanic Panic, both in relation to Dungeons and Dragons and not in relation to Dungeons and Dragons, and your other experiences with it. So what we thought we would do is make a little follow-up video to our video about the Satanic Panic and talk about some of the comments that you guys left and talk about some of the things that you've sent us, objects that you have sent us relating to that whole topic.
Exactly, and that to me, that was the cool thing about doing that video, was hearing what other people went through during the Satanic Panic. I wasn't really expecting that. I expected people to make a few comments about, I remember that. No, we got entire stories almost, if you will, about the way people experienced the D&D, the Satanic Panic's influence on Dungeons and Dragons, and we thought that was really cool. So, having said that,
we've got quite a lengthy one here to begin with. Do you want to read it or do you want me to read it?
I don't care.
All right.
You go ahead.
So, again, having to do with Satanic Panic, this comment says, I was born in 1978, and I remember growing up not being allowed to read fantasy novels at my grandparents' house, not being allowed to dress up in traditional Halloween costumes like demons, devils, skeletons, etc. My father wouldn't allow me to dress up in band t-shirts or go to the local arcade because it was a den of drug dealers and pushers. Then in the late 80s, something flipped and my parents evened out, with quotation marks, is the best way that I can put it. I got into role-playing, and in high school, more specifically, got into RIFTS. Rifts.
I don't know what that is.
I'm not sure what that is either. If that makes us sound dumb, we are. So,
let us know what.
Yeah, let us know if you know what that is, because I'm not exactly sure. For years, my parents said nothing and did nothing as I enjoyed role-playing games, listened to heavy metal music, etc., etc. They saw the covers of the books. They watched me reading at the breakfast table. They knew I played. Then movies like The Crow and The Craft came around. The goth movement was in full swing, and parents were talking about Wiccan all the time. It also didn't help that we had several high school bands named Kettle Cadaver and Meat Cleaver, having a Scandinavian death metal aesthetic. My father made me throw all of my role-playing stuff away. I lost hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars worth of books, dice, etc. I am sure that my parents had good intentions, having gotten caught up in the Wiccan panic part of the Satanic Panic, but I am still salty about it today. Now this is very interesting because this seems to be kind of talking more specifically about not necessarily the early to mid 80s aspect of the Satanic Panic, but just the continuation, the next iteration of what that morphed into, which is, late 80s, early 90s, kind of getting into the even mid 90s goth kind of thing, with a little more screamo, heavy metal kind of stuff that people were really starting to dislike.
And I think that's interesting, because we actually had a couple of people comment, and I don't know that we actually brought those comments to the table today. But some people actually said, guys, you do understand that the Satanic Panic continued through the 90s, and it was still felt today, and it is still felt today. And the more I thought about it, it really is. And I guess we were very focused just on the whole 1980s-ish
Stranger Things, glam metal kind of.
Because it was really triggered by the Stranger Things references. That's where we came from. That was where we got
the idea, at least, to talk about it.
But a lot of people did point out that if you depending on who you talk to today, this is still. It's still having repercussions. Yeah. But this was interesting to me that it all went through, the 1980s. This gentleman or woman, had no problem throughout the 1980s, but all of a sudden, like you say, it was witches. So some witch thing got in there, and I love high school bands Kettle Cadaver and Meat Cleaver.
I like Kettle Cadaver especially. I'm not even sure what that's trying to insinuate, but I like it.
Well, I'm kind of thinking Cadaver Stew going on there, But anyway, just interesting that there was almost a different perspective or a different direction that this person was affected by that whole Satanic Panic and later generation Satanic Panic situation.
Just how the hysteria about things that weren't necessarily middle-class American normal continue to permeate.
Yep. Moving on. Next one. Love your show and enjoyed listening to your spin on the Satanic Panic.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. The only instance of experiencing the Satanic Panic that this person had was not with D&D. My friend's mom saw that I had brought a couple of He-Man toys with me, and he wasn't allowed to play with me after that. And I do remember this. I have direct experience. Not that I was... Nobody, was against me because of my He-Man toys. But I do remember it was the setting. There was, because that was like Skeletor.
Yeah, Skeletor is the one that came to mind for...
Right. Yeah. And so I think that, granted, this is not D&D, but it's that whole...
Fantasy, there's a lot of swords and
skeletons
dead
and
people,
undead and whatever. And I think that that's what this is referring to. But I do remember specifically there being an outcry about the He-Man characters. And it was mostly centered around, as I remember, Skeletor. But it was all fantasy... fantasy science fiction-y things, and there were a lot of people who bought into the Satanic Panic, for D&D at least, who couldn't handle that whole He-Man was it Masters of the Universe, I think?
That sounds right.
Overall, anyway, the He-Man characters with Skeletor and all the rest. But again, it was just because it had a background that was a fantasy setting.
Yeah. Next. I even had to deal with it. Next comment. I even had to deal with it when I started playing D&D in the late 90s. Again, continuation into later periods.
Yeah.
And I live in the Seattle area. Not exactly a religious area of the country, but people were freaked out by D&D. I guess with the rising crime wave of the 80s, everyone was looking for something to blame. And that's interesting to talk about because, again, tying this all into kind of what was going on at the time, I think is very, very pertinent. And taking the religious aspect out of it as well is interesting because I think that a lot of the references, at least that we talked about in the main video, were not necessarily religiously based, but there was a lot of religious influence in the things that were being talked about, and a lot of the fear and justification for that fear was from a religious perspective amongst the people who were broadcasting it and their opinions to a large group of people and a large audience. But that, I wasn't there, obviously, but I'm sure that there was, from what I understand, there was a good deal of concern that there was an increase in crime that was going on, during like the Reagan administration and things like that.
Well, let me try and explain kind of a sequence of events here that I think would fit, and forgive me if I don't explain this well, but I think that a lot of the people, in the 1980s. A lot of it was religious centered. A lot of the Satanic Panic was religious centered. Mm-hmm. But I think at the same time, a lot of the people in the 80s and going into the 90s, as is referenced by this individual's comment, I think that a lot of the people who were concerned about the influence of Dungeons and Dragons were not necessarily worried about its influence on someone's soul or someone's religious outlook. I think that there were more concerned, not everybody, but I think there was a substantial proportion of people who were just concerned that if you played D&D, you were a bad person.
Yeah.
Not because...
Or you would be surrounded by bad people.
People who would commit crimes, people who would break into things, people who would murder your cat or your dog. But it wasn't necessarily religious. There wasn't a religious bent behind what these people were thinking. It was just that you're a bad person because you play this game. Because we've seen that in the 1980s when these other people brought this up. Mm-hmm. But the people in the 80s were more of a religious bent as opposed to the later years when people were not so driven by the religious side of things.
And I think that's not to say that it was one way or the other.
No.
Just based off the time period. But, and again, I think that more publicly it seems like there was a lot of religion that was put behind it, especially initially. But I think you're completely right in that it was just a fear. People want to protect their kids or whatever it may be. And so that fear of association, negative association, people getting hurt, things like that was what they latched onto. Even if it was completely unjustified, that's still where they got it from, and not that they were going to go to hell because they played the game.
Next one. I remember that my local town paper reprinted a speech by some nutjob preacher from who knows where that made all of these satanic claims back in the early 1980s. I sent an op-ed to the paper refuting it, and at the time I was a devout Baptist, not anymore.
parentheses.
And the paper printed it. I was happy that my comments were accepted by people I knew, and it seemed like most everyone I came into contact with weren't swallowing the obtuse claims about Satanism. For some reason, people are extremely gullible when it comes to things they know nothing about. Interesting, and I think that's really interesting. And I wonder how many people's experience was more like that.
Yeah.
That, granted, there's some really bad experiences, but I think a lot of people, as long as they stood up and said, no, here's what's really going on.
You don't know what you're talking about.
I think that there might have been a lot more acceptance than we understand.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's worth acknowledging. So next, this is from a French commenter.
This was
which
interesting.
Very interesting. We had our own little satanic panic here in France in the early 90s due to a TV show that featured a sensationalist documentary on RPGs. It lasted a few years and it really quickened the end of the first golden era of RPGs in the country. Mind you, it was nothing to do with religion, but more with the perceived danger of RPGs regarding mental health. Which again, kind of what we were talking about before. And this is interesting to hear the European perspective on it because... Yes. At least for us, we do have a lot of, European people who watch, international people in general who watch our videos, but having this perspective is really interesting because it's not necessarily where my mind went in terms of, where my kind of past understanding of what the Satanic Panic was. It was an American thing, in my mind, not an international thing, and that's not the case at all.
And I was really pleased to get that comment. Mm-hmm. And we've had some other comments from, there were some from Great Britain, and there were also some from Australia.
Yeah.
And they all had a different perspective too. And I want to say that the ones from Australia did mention it was actually more of the satanic concerns. Mm-hmm. Whereas in Europe, it was much more of a mental health perspective that made D&D and the RPGs dangerous.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
I would love to know what the TV show was. There wasn't any specifics given or what the documentary was, but I don't speak French, but if it has subtitles, I'd love to watch it. So if you're watching this, let us know what it was. Because I'm kind of curious, if nothing else. And
I would be interested to know. They said that this was the early 90s. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that the documentary show was probably something akin to 60 Minutes here in the United States.
That's my guess.
But I was just curious. It does say it was the 90s. The 60 Minutes show that came out with Gary Gygax, where they attacked him for D&D being satanic, that had to predate this then by probably 8 years or so. Mm. And it would have just been interesting to see if the Gary Gygax 60 Minutes interview then had a fairly quick knock-on effect to places in Europe who are going to try and make money off of the same subject matter. Yeah. I'd really be interested to know a little bit more about that. So anyone who lives outside the U.S. who has information about how the Satanic Panic or the RPG concern panic progressed outside of the United States, we'd love to hear more about it just because I'm interested in that kind of history. So.
It probably won't be mentioned in a video, but we'd still love
to hear it. Yeah. We'd really like to hear it. Are you... No, I'm up.
Yeah, your turn.
Let's see. If you look into the history of witch hunts throughout history, as well as the other tensions that were happening at the time, it gives you a good framework for looking at how the Satanic Panic and the scapegoating of everything D&D rose in the States. It also has to do with the rise of the evangelical right and the apocalyptic fears of the Cold War. Everyone was on edge. I think that's
a fair claim to say.
I think that nails it right there. Mm-hmm. Pretty much the gist is, though, that when there are massive social tensions, such as in the 70s and 80s, people start looking for people to blame, and that is exactly what they did, and a fringe game was easy to toss in. And I think that that's really kind of the focus of our original video.
Yeah.
I think they're reinforcing what our perspective was, that there were social tensions, there was massive social change that started clear back in the late 60s, and that wave was just peaking right there in the 80s, and it was kind of, at the end of the day, it was the result of a perfect storm. The Satanic Panic was the result of a perfect storm.
There's no one thing that caused any of it, I don't think. You have to take it, like you said, going back even the mid-60s into that, all those different things just tie in together. Yep. It's a perfect storm, like you said. Up next. My sister comment. My sister still believes that D&D is evil. I just started playing a campaign with my daughter, and my sister was trying to tell my kid not to play. That's an interesting one.
Well, we had a lot of people commenting, though, about how they still are affected by this, even today. Here in 2020 something.
I mean, I've had not anything serious ever, but I've had experiences with people that I know who are at least concerned that there will be a negative connotation associated with it.
Right.
So it's not that I think it was more when I was younger that was the case, but it's still something that, like this person said,
yeah,
very pertinent. It's not something that's gone away.
And we had several comments.
Yeah.
Stating that.
Yeah.
Next comment, and this was, I made a reference to there being retractions printed on page 400 in newspapers, and someone, John,
sorry,
commented, newspapers used to have 400 pages. Okay, no, they didn't. I don't know. I mean, New York Times maybe 200. I don't know. But anyway, no, John, they don't have 400 pages. But then he goes on to say, I think the key thing you mentioned is, did that sell newspapers? And it's all about the money. And I think that there's a lot of blame to be laid on the feet or at the feet of the media.
Yeah,
for taking this and running with it in order
60 minutes
to bring in viewers.
Like that. It's sensationalist. If it's attention grabbing, people will watch it.
Yep.
So this next comment was actually something that we received on Instagram. One of our Instagram posts talking about the Satanic Panic a while back. This wasn't on the video itself, but still pertinent.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
This one.
This one's a little longer. I remember after playing a session in grade school, coming out of the classroom and being confronted by the pastor of a church that was maybe 200 yards down the road from our school. He came over and asked who the leader of our coven was. We were like, WTF, are you talking... What are you talking about, man? Then we all pointed and said, he's our dungeon master. We were pointing to a kid in 5th grade. We were in 2nd through 6th. The pastor led into him with hateful speech full of...
If you want to say lit into him.
Yeah, lit into him with hateful speech full of, you are evil, corrupting other children, and going to hell, while he started handing out Chick Tract comic pamphlets to us and our teacher that was in the room with us. The next week when our game let out, the pastor was waiting outside the room for us, but what he didn't expect was the teacher and most of our parents had hung around and checked out the game for themselves, followed us out of the classroom. They told us to go play on the recess yard while they lit into the pastor for the next 45 minutes, yelling at him about how he was going to hell for lying to his congregation and terrifying children to further his own agenda. They wouldn't let him leave either until each adult had said their piece about what his speech did to their kid. Our parents showed up to his church on Sunday, too, for like a month and talked to all who would listen about the pastor, what he did, and how much good D&D had done for their kids. Finally, the pastor left. We had to start like 4 or 5 more groups because of all the new signups. Nice.
I love this comment.
Yeah.
I think this is really cool because, and I think that it goes back to, I hate for us to be coming across like we're saying that this was this overwhelming, totally destructive. Everybody bought into what was being pushed. I don't want us to come across as we're as pushing that, because that's not what we try to do.
Because people deserve more credit.
They do,
that.
And I think that particular comment shows that there were parents out there who were willing to say, wait a minute,
Yeah, that doesn't make sense.
That doesn't work with what my kid is like. I need to find out for myself. And there were other comments too. There were a number of other comments by people who said, my parents, when they heard about all this, they sat me down and said, okay, what's going on? What's this about? And they would play the game with their kids. So there were, I'm sure, huge numbers, and I would say probably the majority of parents who were very rational about this entire thing, and just said, well, let me find out exactly what's happening. And then they let their kids go on their way, but that's what you do as a parent. Sadly, though, there was a very vocal minority who managed to get the media on their side, and they were the ones who caused so much grief for a lot of kids back at this time.
But within this comment, he mentioned something, or they mentioned something called a Chick Tract.
Yes.
Yeah, started handing out Chick Tract comic pamphlets to us and our teacher that was in the room with us, and we actually received one of these Chick Tracts. One of you guys sent us one of these because we weren't exactly sure what was being referenced here.
And I knew what had been referenced, but I'd never actually seen one.
Yeah.
That was the thing. And Jeffrey, and that's all I'm going to say is his name is Jeffrey.
Yeah.
He contacted us and said, I've got one of these if you would like to see it. And so he sent this to me. And Jeffrey, thank you very much for this, because
appreciate this. Is very kind of you.
This really opened my eyes to this whole subject. And what we would like to do is read this to you. We're not going to pass a judgment on it, but we do want to read it, and then I will probably get a quick photo of these individual pages and put them up on this video so that you have some idea of what the Chick Tract was, what was being handed out to kids at the time. It's just one of the ways that the people who are very concerned about the influence of Satan on Dungeons and Dragons players, this was how they got their message across. So anyway, Dark Dungeons, we're going to read this to you after we finish all these comments.
Well, actually, we could save the last comment here for the very end.
Let's do that.
Talk about this
Let's
first.
do that.
Yeah.
Dark Dungeons. Now, this was put out by a man by the name of Jack. I want to say, and we've had people comment saying, it's this, Jim. I want to say it's Jack Chick. And he has a whole series, he created a whole series of these little comic books that covered a variety of different subjects. They're all Christian-based, evangelical-based, I would say. And this particular one, Dark Dungeons, is solely focused on the evil influences of Dungeons & Dragons.
I would like to say before we start that when I read this through for the second time just a second ago, the image that was put on the front of this was completely unsuccessful in the message that it wanted to get across, because I thought this was really cool and it made me want to play D&D.
It is a good picture, we'll show this. We'll throw this up on the screen. So let's read Dark Dungeons really quickly here. Should I just read it through?
Just go and rip through it there.
Okay, I'll throw these pages up as I go through them. Hopefully, I'll be able to match this up with
it's very short.
What I'm saying. So it starts out, there are a group of young people around a table, and there is an adult woman, adult female, sitting behind a Dungeon Master screen at one end of the table. Adult woman says, "Okay, wizard, cast your spell." Girl says, "Okay, Dungeon Master, my spell of light blinds the monster." The woman then says, "The thief, Blackleaf, did not find the poison trap, and I declare her dead." This young woman, another young woman, gets really upset and shrieks, "No, not Blackleaf. No, I'm going to die. Don't make me quit the game. Please don't. Somebody save me. You can't do this." The first young girl who spoke says, "Marcy, get out of here. You're dead. You don't exist anymore." Next page.
Kind of harsh.
It is. It's very harsh. Then the next scene is of the adult talking to this young girl. And this is the young girl who told Marcy that she was dead. The adult woman says to the young girl, "Debbie, your cleric has been raised to the 8th level. I think it's time that you learn how to really cast spells." Debbie says, "You mean you're going to teach me how to have the real power?" And the adult says, "Yes, you have the personality for it now." Then, the next page is of a bunch of adults around a pentagram and an altar, dressed up in robes. And up in the corner it says, "The intense occult training through D&D prepared Debbie to accept the invitation to enter a witch's coven." And the adult woman has her arm on Debbie's shoulder and she says, "I've brought Elfstar to become a priestess and witch." And then one of the people of the coven says, "Welcome, Elfstar. You're now a priestess of the craft and of the Temple of Diana." Then we go to Debbie again. "Ms. Frost, this is fantastic. This makes the game real. It's not a fantasy anymore. Last night I cast my first spell. This is real power." Miss Frost, that's who we now know as the adult female, says, "I knew you were ready by the way you played the game, but this is just the beginning. There is so much more. Which spell did you cast, Debbie?" Debbie says, "I used the mind bondage spell on my father. He was trying to stop me from playing D&D." Then Miss Frost says, "What was the result?" Debbie says, "He just bought me $200 worth of new D&D figures and manuals. It was great."
That would be great.
Yeah. Later that week, "Hey Debbie," this is Debbie's mother apparently. "Hey Debbie, Marcy's on the phone. She wants to talk to you. She's really upset." Now remember, Marcy was the one who had her character die in D&D. Debbie says, "I can't. I'm fighting the zombie. Tell her I'll see her tonight." Then Debbie goes over to see Marcy, and she says, "Hi, Mrs. Anderson. Marcy wanted me to see her tonight." Mrs. Anderson, Marcy's mother, says, "I'm glad you're here, Debbie. Marcy has shut herself in her room and won't come out. She hasn't been herself for weeks. I'm very worried. Ever since her character in the game got killed, it's as though a part of her died. Maybe you can talk some sense into her." Next scene is Debbie screaming, "No!" and Marcy has hanged herself in her room, and she is surrounded by little D&D figures. The note left behind by Marcy is, "It's my fault Blackleaf died. I can't face life alone, Marcy." Then Debbie goes back to talk to Ms. Frost, who is their dungeon master, and she says, "Ms. Frost, I can't get Marcy out of my mind. How could she do something like this? If I'd left the game, she'd be alive today." Ms. Frost says, "Get your priorities straight, Debbie. Your spiritual growth through the game is more important than some lousy loser's life." She goes on to say, "It would have happened sooner or later. Her character was too weak." But then Debbie says, "But the law of our faith is that we can do anything we want as long as we harm no one. But now we have harmed Marcy." And then she thinks, "What have I gotten myself into?" Then Ms. Frost grabs Debbie and says, "Don't be stupid, Debbie. I think you'd better let Elfstar take care of things. You're getting out of control." And then Debbie says, "I don't want to be Elfstar anymore. I want to be Debbie." Then we switch entirely, and there is a sobbing Debbie in a park, and there's an adult man who has come up to her, and she says, "Hey, Debbie, what's wrong? Can I help?" And Debbie says, "I thought I had all the answers, Mike, but now everything is falling apart." Sob. Then Mike says, "Debbie, I told you Jesus is the only answer. I've been praying and fasting for you." And she says, "Why would you do that for me?" And he says, "Because I know what you're involved in. It's a spiritual warfare that you can't win without the Lord Jesus." Debbie says, "What can I do?" And then Mike says, "Come with me to a meeting this afternoon. The speaker came out of witchcraft and he knows what you're up against." And that afternoon, there's a speaker who says, "You who are involved in the occult think you have achieved power, but you have been trapped in a dungeon of bondage. The limited power you have been given is only bait to lure you to destruction." But then the Chick Tract goes on to just talk about ways that you can get in touch with people who can help you get out of this Dungeons and Dragons thing. And on the back here, it's just lists Chick Publications, P.O. Box 3500, Ontario, California. And it's got a place compliments of, so that whoever was the one who purchased this to distribute it could have put their name in there. But anyway,
I kind of want to call that phone number.
I wonder if I think they're still in existence. I think I went to look for Chick Tracts because I wanted to buy one. Mm-hmm. But you could only buy them in minimums of, I want to say, it was almost like 10,000.
No, that's fair, because you're distributing them.
Yeah, you're giving them.
Yeah.
But anyway, I wanted to just bring this up and point this out, that this is the Chick Tract that was distributed by people who were against Dungeons and Dragons being played.
Yeah, form your own conclusions on it.
Yep.
To interpret it how you would like to. But religion was definitely something that was very pertinent, again, to a lot of these fears. So this as evidenced through this.
Right. But I just wanted to say thank you to Jeffrey for sending this to us, because this goes into my collection of Dungeons and Dragons material that I'm slowly amassing things just in order to help preserve them. I'm not a dealer. I want to make sure that these things get preserved going forward. I used to work in a museum. It's a sickness of mine. But anyway, Jeffrey, thank you again.
Yes. That's really all we have in terms of...
No. Well, we have one more comment.
We do have one final comment. We wanted to add some levity back into the situation here at the end.
Because this is a very serious topic for a lot of people, and we wanted to end it on a more positive note.
On a happy note. We received a comment on the Satanic Panic video saying, "Alex, you need an ELO t-shirt, Electric Light Orchestra."
Yes.
Correct? Ask your dad about ELO, which I think is perhaps a reference to the length of my hair.
To his new look.
Yeah, which is fair, because I did look up a picture of the Electric Light Orchestra, and here you can see some of them. Interpret how you will, again. But I'll take it as a compliment. Thank you.
And this comment, again, from our friend Eric Martin, who's been with us since he was subscriber 75.
Absolutely.
And so it's just... I think it's cool that some people have been with us long enough to remember what you used to look like.
So you remember 1950s Alexander, and now we have 1970s Alexander.
There you go. ELO. Eric, it fits.
And I would also like to say thank you to John for commenting again and saying that he doesn't know anything about music unless it's Bachman Turner Overdrive or Led Zeppelin.
That's me.
Yeah. So On that note.
On that more positive note, we're not trying to point fingers at anybody. We just wanted to get things out there to give you a little more in-depth look at the discussion that was generated by our first video.
Yes.
So yeah, check out the Chick Tracts. There are a lot more comments on that particular YouTube episode. If you want to see more of them, go ahead and take it. And then also, we'd love to hear more. This is fascinating stuff to me. This is fascinating D&D history.
This is not just D&D history, but American history.
It's American history. That's a good point.
And world history. This is an important part
exactly right.
of the history of culture in the world during that period of time. So we're all about that. Let us know more of your experiences. Again, probably won't get mentioned in a video unless we talk about it in a podcast or something, but we'd still love to hear it.
Still love to hear it. Really would.
That's really all that we have for this video. Be sure to check out the description down below. We're going to put links to all of our social media stuff, all the things like that. Our Spreadshirt shop is being upgraded. We have some new different images. We have Alebuck's Arcane Emporium, which is a little project we're working on. We'll talk more about that soon, but you can already see some of the images up on the Spreadshirt shop if you find them intriguing. But there's also just a lot of new stuff up there. We've retooled some of it, so go take a look at that. Check that out. All the proceeds from that go back into the channel. Follow our Instagram, everything like that. Check out our website. All the links are down in the description below. And we appreciate you sticking around this long if you made it to the end.
And as always, we love hearing from you. We may not respond to everything. We try to respond to as much as we can, but things fall between the cracks. Some things we just don't get the chance to respond to.
But we do see almost all of them.
Yes,
we try and read almost all the comments.
But we love to hear because it gives us a better perspective on this game that we love playing. And as Alexandra was saying, sometimes it gives us a perspective on even American history and world history. So it's cool stuff.
So, I'm Alex.
I'm Jim.
Keep your sword on free.
Bye-bye.